Imagine holding a gun so small that it can disappear in the palm of your hand. Not hidden, not concealed, just gone. It sounds impossible, more like a toy than a real weapon. But over 100 years ago, someone decided to build exactly that. And somehow, they succeeded. This is the story of the Kolibri, the smallest production pistol ever created. At the beginning of the 20th century, the firearms industry was moving in one direction: bigger, stronger, more powerful. Nations were preparing for war. Militaries were investing in rifles, machine guns, and artillery. Firepower meant survival, and survival meant dominance. In that world, small had no place. At least that's what most people believed. But one man saw things differently. His name was Franz Pfannl. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a general. He wasn't even a traditional weapons engineer. He was a watchmaker. And that detail matters more than anything else, because watchmakers don't think in terms of power. They think in terms of precision, miniaturization, mechanics at the smallest possible scale. Where others saw limitations, Pfannl saw a challenge. What if a firearm could be reduced to its absolute minimum? Not just smaller, but as small as physically possible. A gun that could fit in a pocket, or even smaller. Something discreet, something personal, something that could be carried anywhere. In an era where self-defense was becoming a growing concern, especially in urban environments, the idea was not entirely absurd. But the execution? That was something else entirely. Around 1910, the idea became reality. The Kolibri was born. Its name comes from the German word for hummingbird, and it fits perfectly. Small, light, almost delicate. At first glance, it doesn't look like a real firearm, more like a finely crafted mechanical object, which, in a way, it was. The Kolibri was chambered in an incredibly tiny caliber, 2.7 millimeter Kolibri. To put that into perspective, the bullet is smaller than many air gun pellets. It is one of the smallest centerfire cartridges ever made. Yes, centerfire, not a toy, not a novelty, a real cartridge with a primer, powder, and projectile, just incredibly small. Creating a weapon at this scale was not easy. Every component had to be miniaturized. Every part had to function perfectly. At such a small size, even the slightest imperfection could cause failure. This is where Pfannl's background as a watchmaker became critical. He understood precision. He understood tolerance. He understood how to make tiny mechanisms work reliably. And he applied that knowledge to something no one expected: a firearm. Despite its size, the Kolibri used a standard blowback operation, just like larger semi-automatic pistols. When fired, the pressure from the cartridge pushed the slide backward, ejecting the spent casing, loading a new round, resetting the system. All of this happening inside something that could fit in your pocket like a coin. It's almost absurd, and yet it worked. The Kolibri featured a small detachable magazine, typically holding around 6 rounds. Again, tiny rounds, but still a repeating firearm. Not single shot, not primitive, a fully functional semi-automatic pistol, at the smallest scale imaginable. This is where the story becomes interesting, because creating something is one thing, but finding a purpose for it is another. Who would use such a weapon? The answer lies in the social changes of the time. Urban life was growing, cities were becoming more crowded, personal safety was becoming a concern, and many people wanted discreet means of self-defense. The Kolibri offered exactly that. Something small enough to carry without notice. But here's the critical question. Was it actually effective? Could something so small really serve as a weapon? The answer is complicated. From the moment it appeared, the Kolibri attracted attention, not because of its power, but because of its uniqueness. It was something people had never seen before, a gun that challenged expectations, a gun that didn't make sense, and that made it fascinating. At this point, the Kolibri had achieved something remarkable. It existed, it functioned, it pushed the limits of engineering. But its real story was just beginning. Because soon, people would start asking the question that matters most. Not can it work, but does it actually work? At first glance, the Kolibri looks like a miracle of engineering, a fully functional semi-automatic pistol, small enough to disappear in your hand. But a weapon is not judged by its size. It is judged by one simple question. Can it actually do its job? The Kolibri used one of the smallest cartridges ever produced, 2.7 millimeter Kolibri. And while it was technically a real center-fire round, its power was extremely limited. To understand just how limited, imagine this. The energy produced by this cartridge is closer to a powerful air gun than to a traditional firearm. That alone tells you everything. The bullet fired from the Kolibri had very low mass, extremely light, and while it did have some velocity, it simply wasn't enough. Because in ballistics, energy is a combination of mass and speed, and here both were minimal. The result? Very low stopping power. Historical tests of the Kolibri revealed something surprising. At very close range, it could penetrate soft materials, thin fabric, skin, but beyond that, its effectiveness dropped rapidly. In some cases, it struggled to penetrate thicker clothing. This raises an obvious question. Could it actually be used for self-defense? In most realistic scenarios, no. The Kolibri was simply too weak to reliably stop an attacker. Yes, it could cause injury. Yes, it could potentially be dangerous. But as a defensive weapon, it was unreliable at best. However, there is another side to this story. Not physical, but psychological. Even a very small firearm can create fear. The presence of a gun, any gun, changes behavior. In certain situations, that alone can be enough. Deterrence, intimidation. The Kolibri may not have been powerful, but it still looked like a firearm. And sometimes perception matters. Because of its size, the Kolibri was extremely difficult to handle. The grip was tiny, the sights were minimal, the barrel was very short. All of this made accurate shooting a challenge, even at close range. So not only was it weak, it was also hard to aim effectively. Miniaturization comes at a cost, and in the case of the Kolibri, that cost included reliability. Small components are more sensitive to dirt, wear, manufacturing imperfections. Any small issue could cause malfunctions. For a weapon, this is a serious problem because reliability is everything. This is where historians begin to disagree. Some believe that the Kolibri was never truly intended to be a serious defensive weapon. Instead, they see it as a novelty, a demonstration of craftsmanship, a luxury item. Something to show what was possible, not necessarily what was practical. Even in its own time, the Kolibri attracted attention not just from buyers, but from enthusiasts. People who appreciated engineering, precision, uniqueness. It was not just a tool, it was a conversation piece, and that made it valuable in a different way. The idea behind the Kolibri was powerful. A weapon so small it could be carried anywhere, invisible, effortless. But the reality did not match the idea. Because when you reduce something too far, you begin to lose what made it effective in the first place. The Kolibri did something very important. It asked a question. How small can a firearm become before it stops being useful? And the answer was right in front of everyone. As people began to understand its limitations, the appeal of the Kolibri started to fade. Other small pistols existed, larger, more powerful, still concealable, but far more effective. And naturally, people chose those instead. By now, the truth was clear. The Kolibri was not a practical weapon. But that did not make it a failure, because its story was never just about power. It was about pushing limits, and in that sense, it succeeded. By the time the limitations of the Kolibri became widely understood, something interesting had already happened. It had captured attention, not as a weapon of power, but as a symbol of possibility. Most firearms are judged by effectiveness, power, range, reliability. The Kolibri failed to compete in all three, and yet it survived in memory. Because sometimes practicality is not what makes something important. Sometimes it's uniqueness. The exact number of Kolibri pistols produced is still debated. Estimates vary, but most historians agree that production numbers were relatively low. This was not a mass-produced military weapon. It was a niche product, and that makes a huge difference, because rarity creates value. To understand why the Kolibri existed at all, you have to look at the era. Early 1900s Europe was a place of innovation, new ideas, new technologies, new possibilities. At the same time, there was a growing market for personal defense. Small, concealable pistols became popular. But while others focused on balance, the Kolibri went to the extreme. Many believe that the Kolibri was marketed not just as a weapon, but as a luxury item, a finely crafted object, something elegant, something unique. Owning one was not just about self-defense, it was about owning something rare, something different. This is where the background of Franz Pfannl becomes important again. The Kolibri was not just small, it was precise, carefully engineered, finely manufactured. It reflected the same attention to detail found in high-end watches. Tiny parts, perfect alignment, delicate mechanisms. It was almost more art than weapon. Today, the Kolibri is highly valued by collectors, not because of what it can do, but because of what it represents. It is one of the smallest firearms ever made, a rare piece of engineering history, a conversation starter. Owning one is like owning a mechanical curiosity, something that challenges expectations. Because of its rarity and uniqueness, the Kolibri has become expensive on the collector's market. Prices can be surprisingly high, far higher than its practical value would suggest. But that's how collectors think. They are not buying utility, they are buying history. Imagine placing a Kolibri on a table. Most people wouldn't even recognize it as a firearm until you explain, until you show them how it works. And suddenly, it becomes fascinating. That reaction alone is part of its appeal. Over time, the Kolibri developed a reputation, the smallest gun in the world, the weakest firearm ever made, the most useless pistol. Some of these descriptions are exaggerated, some are unfair, but all of them contribute to its myth, and myths keep stories alive. The Kolibri sits on a very interesting line. It is technically a weapon. It functions like a weapon, but in reality, it behaves more like a curiosity, a demonstration of what is possible, not necessarily what is practical. If you judge the Kolibri as a weapon, it failed. If you judge it as an engineering experiment, it succeeded. If you judge it as a collector's item, it became legendary. And that's the key to understanding its story. By now, the Kolibri had already secured its place in history, not through power, not through dominance, but through uniqueness. By the time the Kolibri faded from practical use, it had already answered a question that engineers had been asking for years. How small can a firearm become? And more importantly, What happens when you go too far? In most areas of technology, smaller is better. Phones, computers, electronics, everything becomes more efficient as it shrinks. But weapons follow different rules, because a weapon is not just a machine, it is a tool designed to deliver force, and force requires energy. The Kolibri faced a problem that no amount of engineering could fully solve: physics. A smaller cartridge means less powder, less energy, less impact. There is a point where reducing size begins to destroy effectiveness, and the Kolibri reached that point. To truly understand the Kolibri, you have to compare it with other small firearms. There were many pocket pistols at the time, larger than the Kolibri, still compact, but significantly more powerful. Those weapons struck a balance, small enough to carry, powerful enough to matter. The Kolibri chose a different path. It sacrificed power for size, and that choice defined everything. So why are we still talking about it today? Why does the Kolibri still appear in discussions, collections, and videos? Because it represents something rare, a true extreme. Most designs aim for balance. The Kolibri ignored balance completely. It went all the way to one side, and in doing so, it showed where the limit is. Every engineer, designer, and inventor can learn something from this story. More is not always better, but less is not always better either. There is always a point where improvement turns into compromise and then into failure. The Kolibri crossed that line, but by crossing it, it revealed where it was. At the center of all of this is still one man, Franz Pfannl, a watchmaker who decided to challenge the boundaries of his time. He did not create the most powerful weapon, he did not create the most successful one, but he created something unforgettable, and that matters. It's easy to look at the Kolibri and call it useless, but that would miss the point. It was not just a product, it was an experiment, a question turned into reality. And experiments are not judged only by success. They are judged by what they teach us. There is something about extremes that captures attention. The biggest, the fastest, the smallest. The Kolibri belongs in that category. It is the smallest, and that alone is enough to keep people interested. In the end, the Kolibri did not change warfare. It did not dominate battlefields. It did not redefine self-defense. But it did something else. It showed what happens when you push an idea to its absolute limit. In a world obsessed with power, someone chose to create the smallest possible gun. Not the strongest, not the most effective, just the smallest. And in doing so, they proved something important. There is always a limit, and sometimes finding that limit is more important than crossing it.